The stagecoach lurched violently as it hit another rut in the dirt road, sending Nora O'Brien's stomach into a nauseating flip that had nothing to do with the baby growing inside her. She pressed a hand to her belly, hidden beneath the loose folds of her traveling dress, and tried to quell the rising panic that had been her constant companion during the 3-day journey from Denver to Holbrook, Arizona territory. The year was 1885, and at 22 years old, Nora found herself alone, pregnant, and heading toward a marriage with a man she'd never met. The coach rounded a bend, and Nora caught her first glimpse of Holbrook through the dust-streaked window. The small frontier town rose from the harsh landscape like a mirage, a collection of wooden buildings strung along a main street, with scattered homesteads dotting the surrounding countryside. In one of those buildings, her future husband, Howard Mills, was waiting the man who had responded to her advertisement in the matrimonial newspaper, the man who had agreed to marry her despite her condition, the man who had sent her the train and stage-coach fare to Arizona. "First time in Holbrook, miss?" the elderly woman seated across from her asked, her weathered face creasing with a kindly smile. "Yes, madam," Nora replied, attempting to return the smile despite her nervousness. "I'm to be married." The woman's eyes brightened. "A wedding, how wonderful!" "And who's the lucky fellow?" "Mr. Howard Mills," Nora said, the name still feeling foreign on her tongue. "He owns a cattle ranch outside of town." A shadow passed over the woman's face so quickly Nora almost missed it. "The Mills place, out by Cottonwood Creek." Nora nodded, a cold feeling settling in her chest. "Do you know him?" The woman hesitated, then patted Nora's hand. "I'm sure you'll be just fine, dear. Holbrook's a welcoming place for those looking to start anew." Before Nora could press further, the stagecoach rolled to a stop in front of the town's hotel, a 2-story wooden structure with a wide porch. The driver called out their arrival, and the other passengers began gathering their belongings. Nora remained seated, one hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach. She had told Howard Mills about her condition in her letters, explained about the man who had abandoned her in Denver when he discovered she was with child. Howard had written back that he was a lonely rancher in need of a wife, that he didn't mind about the baby, that he would raise it as his own. It had seemed like a miracle, a chance to escape the whispers and judgmental stares, to give her child a name and a future. Now, stepping down from the stagecoach onto the dusty main street of Holbrook, Nora wasn't so certain. "Miss O'Brien." A tall man approached, removing his hat. He wore a suit that had seen better days and carried himself with an official air. "I'm Sheriff Thomas Parker. I was asked to meet you." Nora's heart skipped a beat. "Is Mr. Mills not here?" The sheriff's expression grew solemn. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news, Miss O'Brien. Perhaps we should step inside the hotel." The lobby of the Holbrook Hotel was mercifully cool after the heat of the Arizona afternoon. Sheriff Parker guided Nora to a quiet corner, away from the curious glances of the other stagecoach passengers. He cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with his task. "There's no easy way to say this, Miss O'Brien. Howard Mills passed away 3 days ago." Thrown from his horse while checking fence lines, by the time his ranch hand found him, it was too late. The words struck Nora like physical blows. She swayed slightly, gripping the arm of her chair to steady herself. "I see," she managed, though she didn't see it all. What she saw was her carefully laid plans crumbling around her. "I'm truly sorry," the sheriff continued. "Mr. Mills had told folks in town he was expecting a mail-order bride. When the telegram about your arrival came through, I thought it best to meet you personally." "That was kind of you," Nora said mechanically, her mind racing. What was she to do now? She had exactly $8.43 to her name, not enough for a return ticket to Denver, even if she had somewhere to return to. The hotel owner, Mrs. Simmons, has arranged a room for you tonight, free of charge, Sheriff Parker said. And in the morning, we can discuss your options. Options. The word echoed hollowly in Nora's mind. What options did an unmarried pregnant woman have in a frontier town where she knew no one? Thank you, Sheriff, she said, rising from her chair with as much dignity as she could muster. If you could direct me to my room, I'd like to rest. Mrs. Simmons, a brisk, practical woman in her 50s, personally showed Nora to a small but clean room on the second floor. Dinner's at 6, she said, though I can have something sent up if you're not feeling social. Alone in the room, Nora finally allowed her composure to crack. Tears streamed down her face as she sat on the edge of the narrow bed, one hand pressed to her mouth to muffle her sobs, the other cradling her stomach. She cried for Howard Mills, a man she'd never met but who had offered her salvation. She cried for her unborn child, who would now enter the world with even less security than before. Mostly, she cried for herself and the desperate circumstances that had brought her to this remote corner of the Arizona Territory. When her tears finally subsided, Nora splashed cold water on her face from the basin provided and stared at her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. Her red-rimmed eyes stared back, but she also saw the determination that had carried her this far. She would not give in to despair. Somehow she would find a way forward. A soft knock at her door roused her from her thoughts. Mrs. Simmons stood in the hallway, a concerned expression on her face. Sheriff Parker mentioned you might be in need of more than just a room for the night, the older woman said. I took the liberty of spreading the word that we have a young lady in need of employment. There's to be a small gathering in the dining room this evening, just a few of the town's respectable citizens who might be of help. Nora's throat tightened with unexpected gratitude. That's very generous of you. We look after our own in Holbrook, Mrs. Simmons replied. And as far as I'm concerned, the moment you stepped off that stage, you became one of us. The dining room of the Holbrook Hotel was modestly filled that evening when Nora made her way downstairs. Mrs. Simmons had lent her a black armband to wear over her blue traveling dress, a token of mourning for the man who was to have been her husband. It felt strange to mourn someone she had known only through letters, but Nora appreciated the gesture that gave her a measure of respectability in the eyes of the townspeople. Sheriff Parker made the introductions. There was Dr. Wilson and his wife, the Reverend and Mrs. Shepard, Mr. Hollister, who owned the general store, and several others whose names blurred together in Nora's anxious state. They were all polite, offering condolences and speaking well of Howard Mills, though Nora noticed they said little of substance about the man himself. And this, the sheriff said finally, is Garrett Bishop from the neighboring ranch to what would have been your property. He and Howard were neighbors. The man who stepped forward was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-browned skin and eyes the color of a summer sky. Unlike the others in their Sunday best, he wore simple ranch clothes, clean but practical, and his dark blonde hair was slightly too long, as if haircuts were an inconvenience rather than a necessity. He might have been 30, or perhaps a few years younger, the lines at the corners of his eyes speaking more of sun and wind than age. Miss O'Brien, he said, his voice deep and resonant as he removed his hat. I was sorry to hear about Howard. He spoke highly of you in his letters. Something in his tone made Nora look at him more closely. There was a careful neutrality in his expression that suggested he was measuring his words. Thank you, Mr. Bishop. Did you know him well? A ghost of a smile touched his lips. As well as anyone in these parts, I suppose. We shared a property line and occasionally helped each other out with cattle drives. Dinner was a subdued affair, with conversation flowing around Nora rather than directly to her. She gathered that the town's options for an unmarried woman were limited. She could assist Mrs. Simmons at the hotel, work as a shop girl at Hollister's general store, or perhaps help at the small schoolhouse if she had educational experience. No one mentioned her condition, though Nora suspected that Mrs. Simmons, with her sharp eyes, had already guessed. As the evening drew to a close, Nora found herself standing on the hotel's front porch, breathing in the cool night air. The sky above Holbrook was a vast canopy of stars unlike anything she had seen in Denver, a breathtaking display that momentarily lifted the weight of her worries. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" Garrett Bishop's voice came from the shadows at the end of the porch. He stepped forward, a thin cigar glowing between his fingers. "My apologies, Miss O'Brien. I didn't mean to disturb your solitude." "You didn't," she assured him. "I was just admiring the stars." He nodded, following her gaze upward. One of the few advantages of being out here in the middle of nowhere. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only when Garrett cleared his throat. "Miss O'Brien, there's something I feel I should tell you about Howard Mills." Nora tensed. "What about him?" Garrett hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Howard wasn't exactly the man he presented himself to be in those letters. He hired someone in town to write them for him. He could barely sign his own name. And his ranch. Well, it's more of a shack with a few head of cattle than the prosperous operation he might have described." The revelation shouldn't have surprised her, yet somehow it did. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I think you deserve the truth before you make any decisions about your future here," he said simply. "Howard wasn't a bad man, just a lonely one who stretched the truth to get what he wanted." Nora wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the mild evening. "And what would you suggest I do with this truth, Mr. Bishop? Return to Denver in disgrace? Seek employment scrubbing floors or serving drinks to cowboys?" The bitterness in her voice surprised even her. Garrett Bishop studied her face for a long moment, then dropped his cigar and ground it out beneath his boot heel. "I have a proposition for you, Miss O'Brien," he said finally. "One that might solve both our problems." Nora raised an eyebrow, wary. "I'm listening. Marry me instead." The words hung in the night air between them. Nora stared at him, certain she had misheard. "I beg your pardon. I'm proposing marriage," Garrett said, his expression deadly serious. "I own a ranch 3 times the size of Howard's, with a proper house and enough cattle to turn a profit. What I don't have is a wife, or the prospect of children." His eyes flicked momentarily to her midsection, confirming Mrs. Simmons wasn't the only one who had guessed her secret. "Mr. Bishop, we've only just met," Nora protested, though she felt a strange flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with her condition. "And you had only just met Howard Mills through his letters he didn't even write himself," Garrett pointed out. "At least with me, what you see is what you get. I won't pretend to be a gentleman or a scholar, but I work hard, I keep my word, and I treat you and your child with respect." Nora was speechless. The proposal was outlandish, impulsive, and yet strangely practical. Here was a solution presented to her where moments ago there had seemed to be none. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why would you do this?" Garrett ran a hand through his hair, looking suddenly uncomfortable. "I've been alone a long time, Miss O'Brien. Running a ranch by yourself wears on a man. I've been putting off finding a wife because, well, there aren't many suitable women in these parts, and I don't have time for courting. When Howard mentioned he'd sent for a bride, I'll admit I was envious." His honesty was disarming. Nora found herself studying him more carefully, the way he stood straight and looked her in the eye, the calluses on his hands that spoke of honest work, the quiet confidence in his manner. "This is madness," she murmured. "Maybe so," he agreed. "But sometimes madness is the most sensible option available." A laugh bubbled up unexpectedly from Nora's throat. "That's quite a philosophy, Mr. Bishop." "Garrett," he corrected, the corner of his mouth lifting in a half-smile. "If you're considering my proposal, you might as well use my given name." Was she considering it? The thought should have been absurd, and yet Nora found herself weighing the possibility. What were her alternatives? To struggle alone in a town where she knew no one, to face the growing evidence of her shame with each passing month, to bring a child into the world without protection or security. "I don't expect an answer tonight," Garrett said, sensing her inner turmoil. "Think about it. Talk to Mrs. Simmons or the sheriff if you want references to my character. I'll come back tomorrow for your answer." He replaced his hat, tipped it slightly in her direction, and descended the porch steps into the darkness of the Holbrook night, leaving Nora with her thoughts and the impossible decision before her. Sleep eluded Nora that night. She lay awake in the unfamiliar bed, her mind racing through possibilities and consequences. By the time the first light of dawn filtered through her window, she had made her decision one born of practicality rather than romance, yet tinged with a curious hopefulness she hadn't expected to feel. Mrs. Simmons brought breakfast to her room, along with information that confirmed what Garrett had told her. He was indeed a successful rancher, respected in the community for his fair dealings and hard work. He kept to himself mostly, but was known to help neighbors in need and had never been in trouble with the law. "He's a good man," Mrs. Simmons said as she poured coffee. "Not one for town socials or church picnics, but solid, dependable. If I were 30 years younger and in your situation, I'd consider his offer seriously." "I am considering it," Nora admitted, "though it seems reckless to agree to marry a man I just met." Mrs. Simmons snorted softly. "No more reckless than agreeing to marry Howard Mills based on letters he paid the schoolteacher to write. At least with Garrett Bishop, you're seeing the genuine article." By mid-morning, Nora had penned a letter to her cousin back in Denver, the only family member who had stood by her when she discovered her condition, explaining her change in circumstances. She was sealing the envelope when Mrs. Simmons knocked at her door. "Mr. Bishop is downstairs," she announced, a hint of excitement in her usually practical tone. Nora smoothed her dress, the same blue traveling outfit, now looking somewhat worse for wear, and took a deep breath. Her decision was made, for better or worse. Garrett stood in the hotel lobby, hat in hand, his posture straight but tense. He had clearly made an effort with his appearance. His hair was trimmed, his face freshly shaved, and he wore a clean white shirt under a dark vest. When he saw her descending the stairs, something in his expression softened. "Miss O'Brien," he said with a slight bow, "I hope you slept well." "As well as could be expected," she replied honestly. "Would you walk with me, Mr. Bishop? I believe we have matters to discuss." They strolled along Holbrook's Main Street, an unlikely pair drawing curious glances from townsfolk going about their morning business. Nora was acutely aware of the whispers that followed them, but Garrett seemed oblivious, or perhaps simply accustomed to being the subject of gossip. "I've given your proposal considerable thought," Nora began when they reached the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open country. "It's unconventional, to say the least." "Most worthwhile things are," Garrett replied, a hint of amusement in his voice. Nora stopped walking and turned to face him directly. "Before I give you my answer, I need to be absolutely clear about something. This child I'm carrying, it will be born in about 6 months. I won't hide it or pretend it's yours if anyone asks. I won't begin our Arrangement with a lie. Garrett's blue eyes met hers steadily. I wouldn't ask you to. The child will be raised as mine in name and care, but I have no interest in deceiving anyone about its origins. And if it's a girl, many men prefer sons. A daughter would be just as welcome, he said without hesitation. I was raised by my mother and sisters after my father died. I have great respect for the strength of women. Nora studied his face, looking for any sign of insincerity and finding none. You should also know that I'm not. That is, I have no experience as a rancher's wife. I was a seamstress in Denver. I don't need experience, Garrett said simply, just willingness to learn and adapt. The rest will come with time. She took a deep breath. Very well, Mr. Bishop, I accept your proposal on one condition. He raised an eyebrow. Which is? That we agree this is a partnership of mutual benefit and convenience. I don't expect love, and neither should you. Something flickered in Garrett's eyes, disappointment perhaps, or resignation. Agreed, he said after a moment, though I would hope we might eventually find friendship at least. Friendship is possible, Nora conceded. Now, when did you envision this wedding taking place? Tomorrow, if Reverend Shepherd is available, Garrett said promptly. The sooner you're settled at the ranch, the better, unless you'd prefer to wait. The practicality of his approach was oddly reassuring. Tomorrow is acceptable. I have nothing to prepare and no one to notify. Garrett nodded, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch. I brought this, just in case you said yes. It belonged to my mother. He tipped the contents into his palm, a simple gold band with a small pearl set in the center. It was modest but lovely, clearly a treasured family piece rather than something hastily purchased. You don't have to wear it if you don't want to, he added quickly. But I thought you should have a proper ring. The unexpected thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Nora deeply. It's beautiful, she said softly. I would be honored to wear it. Garrett's smile transformed his face, erasing the serious lines and revealing a warmth she hadn't glimpsed before. He took her left hand gently and slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if meant for her all along. Well then, Miss O'Brien, he said, still holding her hand. It seems we're engaged. The absurdity of the situation suddenly struck Nora, and she laughed a genuine laugh that surprised them both. Indeed we are, Mr. Bishop. May neither of us live to regret it. He joined her laughter, and for a brief moment, standing at the edge of town with the vast Arizona landscape spread before them, Nora felt a flutter of something that might, in time, become hope. The wedding took place the following afternoon in the small white church that served the Holbrook community. Reverend Shepherd performed the ceremony with solemn dignity, making no mention of the unusual circumstances that had brought the couple together. Mrs. Simmons stood as witness, along with Sheriff Parker, who had taken an avuncular interest in Nora's welfare. Nora wore a dove-gray dress hastily altered by Mrs. Hollister from the general store, who had been a dressmaker in St. Louis before moving west with her husband. The dress skillfully concealed her condition while still appearing appropriate for a bride who was technically in mourning for her intended groom. Her auburn hair was arranged simply beneath a small hat, adorned with a single white feather, another gift from Mrs. Simmons, who had declared that every bride, regardless of circumstances, deserved something special. Garrett wore the same dark vest and white shirt from the day before, freshly pressed, with the addition of a string tie and polished boots. He repeated his vows in a clear, steady voice that betrayed no hesitation, his eyes never leaving Nora's face. When Reverend Shepherd pronounced them husband and wife, Garrett hesitated only briefly before leaning down to place a chaste kiss on Nora's lips, their first physical contact beyond the handshake that had sealed their agreement. His lips were warm and surprisingly soft, the kiss over almost before it began, yet leaving Nora with a curious sense of connection she hadn't anticipated. "Mrs. Bishop," he said quietly as they turned to face their small audience. The name sounded strange to Nora's ears, a new identity to match her new life. A modest reception followed at the hotel, where Mrs. Simmons had prepared a special dinner, and Mr. Hollister contributed a bottle of French champagne that had been gathering dust on his store shelf for years. The townspeople who attended were cordial, if somewhat reserved, clearly unsure what to make of this hasty marriage between Howard Mills's intended bride and his neighbor. "Pay them no mind," Mrs. Simmons whispered to Nora as they watched Garrett accepting congratulations from Sheriff Parker. "They'll gossip for a week, then find something new to talk about. All that matters is that you've secured a future for yourself and your child." "Yes," Nora agreed, though she found herself wondering if there might eventually be more to her marriage than mere security. Something about the way Garrett had looked at her during their vows, the gentle pressure of his hand on hers as he slipped the ring onto her finger, suggested possibilities she hadn't dared consider. As the afternoon waned, Garrett approached her with 2 glasses of champagne, offering one to Nora. "I've settled the bill with Mrs. Simmons," he said. "Whenever you're ready, the wagon is loaded with your trunk." Reality intruded on Nora's thoughts. Tonight she would sleep in Garrett Bishop's home as Garrett Bishop's wife. The champagne suddenly tasted sour in her mouth. Sensing her unease, Garrett leaned closer. "You'll have your own room," he said quietly. "I've prepared the second bedroom. Our arrangement doesn't need to include. That is, not until you're comfortable." Relief and an unexpected twinge of disappointment mingled in Nora's chest. "Thank you," she murmured. "That's very considerate." "I meant what I said yesterday," Garrett continued. "I want this to be a partnership. That means respecting each other's boundaries." Before Nora could respond, Mrs. Hollister approached with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "A wedding gift," she announced, pressing it into Nora's hands. "Just some fabric scraps and thread I thought you might want to continue your sewing while you settle in." Touched by the thoughtful gesture, Nora thanked her sincerely. Other small gifts followed: a jar of honey from the Shepherds, a book of poetry from Dr. Wilson and his wife, a basket of preserved fruits from Mrs. Simmons. Simple offerings, but each representing acceptance of a sort, a tentative welcome into the community. The sun was low on the horizon when they finally took their leave. Garrett handed Nora up into the wagon with careful courtesy, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. As they pulled away from the hotel, Nora looked back at the small gathering of people who had witnessed this unexpected turn in her life. "They're good people," Garrett said, following her gaze. "Once they get to know you, they'll be glad to have you in Holbrook." "If I'm to live here, I suppose I should learn more about the town," Nora replied, settling herself more comfortably on the wagon seat. "How long have you been in Arizona?" The question opened a conversation that carried them out of town and onto the dusty road that led to Garrett's ranch. He had come to the territory 10 years earlier, he explained, after serving briefly in the Army. He had worked as a cowhand on several ranches before saving enough to buy his own land 5 years ago. "It was nothing but scrub and rattlesnakes when I started," he said with a hint of pride. "Now I run about 300 head of cattle and have the beginnings of a decent horse breeding program." "All on your own?" Nora asked, impressed despite herself. "I have 2 ranch hands, Miguel Sanchez and his son Tomas. They live in a cabin near the corral. Good men, hard workers. And there's Mrs. Espinosa, who comes in from town 3 days a week to cook and clean, though she's getting on in years." The mention of the housekeeper raised a question Nora had been avoiding. "Will they? That is, what have you told them about me?" Garrett glanced at her, then returned his attention to the road. "The truth that you were Howard Mills's intended bride, but after his passing, you and I decided to marry instead. Nothing more, nothing less. What they might speculate beyond that is their business." The directness of his approach was refreshing after the whispers and judgments Nora had endured in Denver. "And they won't resent my presence. Taking over the household. Mrs. Espinosa will be delighted to have someone else take an interest in the house. She's been telling me for years that no man should live alone in such a big place." He hesitated, then added, "As for Miguel and Tomas, they're good men who mind their own business. They won't cause you any trouble." The road began to climb slightly, winding through low hills dotted with scrub brush and the occasional juniper. As they crested a rise, Garrett pulled the wagon to a stop. "There it is," he said simply. "Bishop Ranch." Below them stretched a verdant valley, startlingly green against the arid landscape they had been traveling through. A creek meandered through the center, its banks lined with cottonwood trees. Nestled on a small rise near the water stood a substantial ranch house, 2 stories of solid timber and stone, with a wide porch wrapping around 2 sides. Nearby were a large barn, corrals, and several outbuildings, all well maintained. In the pastures beyond, cattle grazed peacefully in the late afternoon sun. It was, Nora realized with a mixture of relief and trepidation, a real home far more substantial than whatever Howard Mills might have offered. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. "I didn't expect." She trailed off, unsure how to express her surprise without sounding insulting. "You didn't expect a bachelor rancher to have such a civilized setup," Garrett finished for her, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "My mother had strong opinions about proper living. When I built this place, I could hear her voice in my ear, insisting on certain standards." He flicked the reins, and the horses began the descent into the valley. As they drew closer, Nora could make out more details: curtains at the windows, a garden plot to one side of the house, even a small orchard of fruit trees just beginning to blossom. "The garden hasn't been properly tended in a while," Garrett said, following her gaze. "Mrs. Espinosa does what she can, but her knees aren't what they used to be. If you've any interest in growing things, you're welcome to take it over." "I'd like that," Nora replied, surprised to realize she meant it. In Denver, living in a small rented room, she had never had the opportunity for gardening. "Though I'll need guidance. My knowledge is limited to the few herbs my mother grew on our windowsill. Miguel's wife was the gardener before she passed. He could advise you, I'm sure." The easy way Garrett spoke of incorporating her into the life of the ranch was reassuring, as if her presence was a natural addition rather than a disruption. They were approaching the house now, and Nora saw a man emerge from the barn, heavyset and dark-haired, wiping his hands on a cloth. He raised a hand in greeting as the wagon rolled into the yard. "That's Miguel," Garrett said, returning the wave. "His son is probably out checking the south pasture." Miguel approached as Garrett brought the wagon to a halt in front of the house. He was older than Nora had expected, perhaps in his 50s, with graying hair and a weathered face that creased into a smile as he looked up at them. "So you brought home a bride after all, patron," he said in accented but clear English. "Senora Bishop, welcome to Cottonwood Creek." "Thank you, Mr. Sanchez," Nora replied, surprised by the warm welcome. "I'm pleased to meet you." "Just Miguel, please," he said, helping Garrett secure the horses. "Everyone here is family, more or less." The casual inclusion in this statement caught Nora off guard. Family was not something she had expected to find at the end of her journey to Arizona. Garrett came around to help her down from the wagon, his hands strong and steady at her waist as he lifted her to the ground. "Let me show you the house," he said. "Miguel can bring your trunk in later." The front door opened onto a spacious living room furnished with a mix of practical pieces and surprisingly elegant touches. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by bookshelves filled with volumes that appeared well-read. Comfortable-looking chairs and a sofa were arranged on a colorful woven rug, while oil lamps on side tables promised warm light in the evening hours. "Mrs. Espinosa keeps things tidy, but I'll warn you now that the dust finds its way in no matter what we do," Garrett said, leading Nora through to a dining room containing a table large enough to seat 8. Beyond that was a kitchen that was clearly the heart of the home, spacious and well-equipped, with a cast-iron stove, a pump at the sink, and cupboards stocked with dishes and cooking implements. "Mrs. Espinosa will show you where everything is kept," Garrett assured her, noticing her slightly overwhelmed expression. "She's particular about her kitchen, but she'll be happy to have someone else take an interest." Upstairs, Garrett showed her to a bedroom at the front of the house, overlooking the valley. It was simply but comfortably furnished with a large bed, a dresser, a washstand, and a small writing desk beneath the window. Curtains of faded blue cotton framed the glass, and a colorful quilt covered the bed. "This will be your room," Garrett said, standing awkwardly in the doorway as if unsure whether to enter. "Mine is at the end of the hall. There's a bathroom between. We have a pump system for water and a copper tub. It's not fancy, but it's private." The consideration in his arrangements touched Nora deeply. "It's lovely," she said sincerely. "Far more comfortable than I expected." A hint of color rose in Garrett's cheeks. "I'll leave you to settle in," he said. "Come down when you're ready, and I'll show you the rest of the property." Alone in the room that was now hers, Nora moved slowly to the window and looked out over Cottonwood Creek Ranch. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the valley and gilding the distant hills with golden light. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way that stirred something inside her, a sense of possibility she hadn't felt in months. Absently, her hand moved to her stomach, to the small life growing there that had set this unlikely chain of events in motion. "Well, little one," she whispered, "it seems we've found ourselves a home after all." When Miguel brought up her trunk a short while later, Nora changed from her wedding dress into a simpler skirt and shirtwaist, then made her way downstairs. She found Garrett in the kitchen, brewing coffee on the stove. "I thought you might like to see the rest of the place before dark," he said, pouring 2 cups. "Unless you're too tired from the journey, I'd like to see it," Nora replied, accepting the coffee. It was strong and hot, exactly what she needed to fortify herself for the next step in this strange new life. The tour of the ranch was brief, but comprehensive. Garrett showed her the barn with its stalls for horses and storage for hay, the chicken coop where a dozen hens provided eggs, the smokehouse where meat was preserved, and the small cabin where Miguel and Tomas lived. They met Tomas returning from checking the cattle, a serious young man of perhaps 20, who tipped his hat respectfully to Nora and congratulated Garrett with genuine warmth. As twilight deepened, they returned to the house, where Miguel had surprised them by preparing a simple supper of beans, cornbread, and stewed beef. "Mrs. Espinosa taught me enough to get by," he explained as they sat down to eat. "But we will all be glad to have a woman's touch in the kitchen again." Nora, who had never considered herself particularly skilled at cooking, smiled nervously. "I'll do my best, though I may need some guidance at first." "Mrs. Espinosa comes tomorrow," Garrett said. "She'll help you find your way around." The meal was strangely comfortable, with Miguel sharing stories of the ranch's early days and Tomas occasionally adding details his father had forgotten. Nora found herself laughing more than once at the tales of Garrett's early mishaps as a rancher. He tried to shoe his own horse, Miguel recounted, eyes twinkling. The poor animal dragged him halfway across the corral before Tomas could catch it. "I've improved since then," Garrett protested good-naturedly. "At least I no longer fall off every time a horse decides to buck." Their easy camaraderie was a revelation to Nora. In Denver, after her condition became known, meals had been silent, uncomfortable affairs with her landlady's disapproving gaze following her every move. Here, despite the unconventional circumstances of her arrival, she was being treated as a welcome addition rather than an unwanted burden. After dinner, Miguel and Tomas took their leave, returning to their cabin for the night. Alone with Garrett for the first time since their wedding, Nora felt a sudden awkwardness descend. "Would you like more coffee?" she offered, rising to clear the dishes. "No, thank you." Garrett remained seated, watching her movements with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. "Nora," he said finally, using her given name for the first time. "I want you to know that I meant what I said about our arrangement. There are no expectations. Not until you're ready, if ever." The directness of his statement brought heat to Nora's cheeks, but she appreciated his candor. "Thank you," she said, keeping her eyes on the dishes she was stacking. "I'm grateful for your understanding. That said," he continued, "I hope that in time we might find more than just convenience in this marriage. I'm not asking for love, I know that's not what you agreed to, but perhaps friendship at least." Nora looked up then, meeting his steady gaze. "I would like that," she said honestly. "Friendship seems a good place to start." Garrett nodded, a small smile softening his features. "Then that's where we'll begin." He rose from the table. "It's been a long day. I'll see you in the morning." That night, lying in her new bed in her new home, Nora listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind in the cottonwoods, the occasional creak of the house settling. So much had changed in the span of a few days. She had arrived in Holbrook expecting to meet her future husband, only to discover he was dead. And now she was married to a different man entirely, living on a ranch miles from town, with a baby on the way and a future that was both more secure and more uncertain than she could have imagined. Yet despite the strangeness of her circumstances, Nora felt an unexpected sense of peace. Garrett Bishop was a good man, that much was already clear. He had offered her not just a name for her child and a roof over her head, but dignity and respect. Whether their unconventional beginning could grow into something more remained to be seen, but for tonight, at least, she would allow herself to hope. The first weeks at Cottonwood Creek Ranch passed in a blur of adjustment and learning. Mrs. Espinosa, a formidable woman in her 60s with iron-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing, took Nora under her wing with a mixture of skepticism and grudging approval. "So you're the mail-order bride who ended up with the wrong groom," she said bluntly on their first meeting. "Well, you did better for yourself than you know. Howard Mills was a drunk who could barely keep his few scrawny cattle alive. Garrett Bishop is a good man who built something from nothing." The frank assessment was startling, but Nora appreciated the honesty. "I'm beginning to see that," she replied, "though I'm not sure I've done anything to deserve such good fortune." Mrs. Espinosa's expression softened slightly. "Life's not about deserving, child. It's about making the most of what comes your way. Now, let me show you how this kitchen works. The stove has a temper of its own, and the pantry needs reorganizing something fierce." Under Mrs. Espinosa's tutelage, Nora began to learn the rhythms of ranch life. She discovered that while she had little talent for cooking complex meals, she could bake bread that even the exacting housekeeper deemed acceptable. She learned to manage the household accounts, to preserve the bounty from the garden, to recognize the signs of approaching weather changes in the Arizona sky. Meanwhile, her pregnancy progressed, her condition becoming more obvious with each passing week. Garrett never mentioned it directly, but she noticed the way he began assigning her lighter tasks, how he made sure she rested in the afternoons, the extra pillows that appeared on her bed to help her find comfort as her body changed. Their relationship evolved with cautious steps. They shared meals and conversation, gradually learning each other's histories and habits. Nora discovered that Garrett had grown up in Missouri, the only son among 4 sisters. His father had died when he was 12, leaving his mother to run their small farm with the help of her children. After the war, with the farm struggling, Garrett had joined the army briefly before heading west to make his fortune. "My mother never approved of my coming to Arizona," he told Nora one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "She thought I'd end up shot by Indians or hung as a horse thief." "What happened to her? And your sisters?" Nora asked, realizing she knew little about his family. A shadow crossed Garrett's face. "Mother passed 5 years ago. 2 of my sisters are married with families back in Missouri. One moved to California with her husband. The youngest, Grace, died of influenza when she was 16. "I'm sorry," Nora said softly, understanding the loss in a way she might not have before. Her own parents had died within months of each other when she was 19, leaving her alone except for distant cousins who had little interest in her welfare. "It was a long time ago," Garrett replied, though the pain was still evident in his voice. "What about your family? You've never spoken much about them." Nora told him then about her childhood in Denver, her father a carpenter whose work had been steady but never lucrative, her mother a gentle woman who had taught Nora to sew and to find beauty in simple things. She spoke of their deaths, of her struggle to support herself as a seamstress, of the handsome salesman who had courted her with promises of marriage only to disappear when she told him she was with child. "His name was Frederick," she said, speaking the name aloud for the first time in months. "He was passing through Denver, selling farm equipment. He was charming, attentive. I thought he loved me." Garrett's expression darkened. "Men like that deserve a meeting with the business end of a bullwhip." The fierce protectiveness in his tone surprised Nora. "It doesn't matter now," she said, one hand resting on her growing belly. "In a way, his betrayal led me here, and despite everything, I can't regret this child." Garrett's gaze followed the movement of her hand. "May I?" he asked hesitantly, gesturing toward her stomach. The request was unexpected, but Nora nodded, taking his hand and placing it where the baby had been kicking earlier. For a moment, nothing happened, and then there was a decisive thump against Garrett's palm. His eyes widened in wonder. "That's quite something," he said, his voice hushed. "He or she is very active in the evenings," Nora replied with a small smile, "especially after dinner." "Takes after its mother, then," Garrett said, withdrawing his hand reluctantly. "I've noticed you're not one for sitting still either." The observation was accurate. Despite her condition, Nora had thrown herself into ranch life with an energy that sometimes surprised even her. Beyond her household duties, she had begun helping Miguel with the garden, learning which plants thrived in the Arizona soil and which needed extra care. She had even started riding, after Garrett found her a gentle mare that could be trusted not to spook. These shared moments, the quiet conversations, the small discoveries about each other, the gradual building of trust were creating something between them that Nora had not anticipated. She found herself watching Garrett when he wasn't aware, admiring the strength in his shoulders as he worked, the gentleness in his hands when he tended an injured calf. the rare but transformative smile that lit his face when something pleased him. It was friendship, certainly, but there were moments when Nora felt something more, stirring a warmth in her chest when he returned from a long day's work, a flutter in her stomach, distinct from the baby's movements when their hands accidentally touched while passing dishes at dinner. One evening in early July, about a month after their wedding, a summer storm rolled in with startling speed. Nora was alone in the house, Garrett, and the men were out checking cattle in the north pasture, and Mrs. Espinosa had left earlier than usual due to the threatening weather. The wind rose suddenly, howling around the eaves and rattling the windows with such force that Nora feared the glass might shatter. Lightning split the darkened sky, followed almost immediately by a crack of thunder that shook the house to its foundations. Rain began to fall in sheets, pounding against the roof and walls. Nora moved from window to window, closing shutters against the onslaught, her concern growing as the storm intensified and the men did not return. Just as she was debating whether to brave the elements to check the barn, the front door burst open, and Garrett staggered in, soaked to the skin and supporting Miguel, whose face was contorted in pain. "What happened?" Nora gasped, rushing forward to help. "Lightning spooked the horses," Garrett explained tersely, guiding Miguel to a chair. "Miguel's took off and he went down hard on his left leg. I think it might be broken." Nora's seamstress training had included basic first aid necessary in a profession where needles and scissors posed constant dangers. "Let me see," she said, kneeling beside Miguel's chair. "Where's Tomas?" "Still out looking for the scattered cattle," Garrett said, pushing his wet hair back from his face. "He'll come in when he can." Gently, Nora examined Miguel's leg, wincing at his sharp intake of breath when she touched the swelling below his knee. "I don't think it's broken," she said after a careful assessment. "But it's a bad sprain at least. We need to get these wet clothes off him and elevate the leg." Together, she and Garrett helped Miguel to the sofa, where Nora carefully removed his boot and rolled up his sodden trouser leg. The ankle was already swelling dramatically, the skin turning purplish with bruising. "Cold compresses first," she directed, "then bandages to stabilize it, and he'll need dry clothes before he catches his death." Garrett nodded, clearly impressed by her calm efficiency. "I'll get him something to wear. Can you handle the compresses?" "Of course." Nora was already moving toward the kitchen for ice from the icebox and clean cloths. For the next hour, they worked together to treat Miguel's injury, Nora applying compresses and bandaging the ankle while Garrett prepared a hot toddy to ward off the chill. When Tomas finally arrived, equally drenched but unharmed, they explained the situation and made arrangements for Miguel to sleep in the house until he could safely return to the cabin. It was well past midnight when the household finally settled. Miguel was installed on the sofa with his leg elevated. Tomas had returned to the cabin after making sure his father was comfortable. And the storm had moved on, leaving behind only steady rain and occasional distant rumbles of thunder. In the kitchen, Nora made a fresh pot of coffee while Garrett, now in dry clothes, sat at the table looking exhausted but relieved. "You were remarkable tonight," he said as she placed a steaming cup before him. Most women would have panicked at a man being carried and half drowned with a potentially broken leg. Nora smiled wryly. "I'm not most women, as I think we've established." "No," Garrett agreed, his eyes warm as they rested on her face. "You're certainly not." The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither of them had acknowledged. Then Nora felt a particularly vigorous kick from the baby and winced slightly, her hand going automatically to her stomach. Garrett noticed immediately. "Are you all right? Is it the baby?" "Just letting me know it's time for sleep," Nora assured him. It's been an eventful evening for all of us. Garrett rose and came around the table to stand before her. In the soft lamplight, with his hair still damp and curling slightly at his neck, he looked younger, more vulnerable than the capable rancher she had come to know. "Nora," he said quietly, "I want to thank you, not just for tonight, but for everything since you arrived. You've brought something to this house, to this ranch, that was missing before." The sincerity in his voice made her throat tighten. "I should be thanking you," she replied. "You offered me a home when I had nowhere else to go. It's more than that." Garrett hesitated, then reached out to take her hand. His palm was warm against hers, the calluses on his fingers testimony to the hard work that had built this place. "I know our arrangement began as one of convenience, but these past weeks, I've come to care for you, Nora, more than I expected to." The confession hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. Nora looked into his eyes and saw no deception there, only a mixture of hope and uncertainty that mirrored her own feelings. "I've come to care for you too," she admitted softly. "Though I wasn't sure if that was part of our agreement." Garrett's smile transformed his face. "I think we can amend the terms," he said, his voice lighter than she had ever heard it, "if you're willing." In answer, Nora stepped closer and, rising on her toes, pressed her lips to his in a kiss that was tentative at first, then deepening as Garrett's arms came around her, mindful of her pregnant belly between them. When they finally parted, both were slightly breathless, their faces flushed with more than just the kitchen's warmth. "Well," Garrett said, his voice rough with emotion, "I think that settles the amendment." Nora laughed softly, resting her forehead against his chest. "Yes, I believe it does." That night, for the first time since their wedding, Nora fell asleep with Garrett's arms around her, his hand resting protectively over the child that would soon join their unconventional family. Outside, the gentle rain continued, washing the world clean and preparing for the dawn of a new day at Cottonwood Creek. August arrived with relentless heat that shimmered over the valley like a living thing. Nora, now 7 months pregnant, found the heat particularly challenging. Her body, already adjusting to the dramatic changes of pregnancy, struggled with the additional burden of temperatures that routinely climbed above 100 degrees by midday. Garrett, observing her discomfort, took to waking before dawn to complete as much of the ranch work as possible before the worst of the heat set in. He arranged for a large copper tub to be placed under the shade of the cottonwoods by the creek, where Nora could soak in the cool water during the hottest part of the day. Mrs. Espinosa taught her to make aguas frescas, refreshing drinks of fruit and water that helped combat the heat. Despite the physical discomfort, these were happy days for Nora. Her relationship with Garrett had deepened since that stormy night, evolving into something neither of them had anticipated when they made their practical arrangement. They still maintained separate bedrooms, a concession to propriety and Nora's advancing pregnancy, but they shared increasingly tender moments, holding hands while watching the sunset from the porch, exchanging kisses in the kitchen when Mrs. Espinosa wasn't looking, talking late into the night about their hopes for the future. "Have you thought about names?" Garrett asked one evening as they sat by the creek, their feet dangling in the cool water. "For the baby, I mean." Nora looked at him in surprise. They had spoken of the child often, but always in general terms. This was the first time Garrett had shown interest in such a specific aspect of the baby's future. "I've considered a few," she admitted. "If it's a girl, I thought perhaps Elizabeth, after my mother, or maybe Grace." She watched his face carefully as she mentioned his sister's name. Emotion flickered in Garrett's eyes. "Grace," he repeated softly. "I'd like that." "And for a boy?" he asked after a moment. Nora hesitated. "I had thought perhaps James, after my father, but..." She trailed off, uncertain how to express what she was thinking. "But," Garrett prompted gently. "But I was also considering Garrett," she said, not meeting his eyes. "As a middle name, at least." His hand found hers, squeezing gently. "James Garrett Bishop," he said thoughtfully. "It has a nice sound to it." The use of his surname, their shared name now for her child, still sometimes caught Nora by surprise. The baby would be a bishop, would grow up on this ranch, would never know the man whose blood ran in its veins. Instead, it would know Garrett as its father, Garrett, who had chosen to give this child his name and his protection without hesitation. "You're thinking too hard," Garrett observed, nudging her shoulder with his. "I can see the wheels turning." Nora smiled apologetically. "Just reflecting on how different things turned out from what I expected when I left Denver." "Better or worse?" Garrett asked, his tone light though his eyes were serious. "Better," Nora said without hesitation. "Far better than I could have hoped for." The sincerity in her voice brought a pleased flush to Garrett's face. He leaned over to press a kiss to her temple, his lips lingering against her skin. "For me as well," he murmured. Their peaceful moment was interrupted by the distant sound of a wagon approaching. Garrett stood, helping Nora to her feet with a steadying hand. "That'll be Doc Wilson," he said. "I asked him to ride out and check on you today." "I'm perfectly fine," Nora protested, though secretly she was relieved. The baby had been particularly active lately, and she'd experienced some discomfort that she hadn't wanted to worry Garrett with. "Humor me," Garrett said, guiding her back toward the house. "Having a baby on a ranch 20 miles from town makes me a bit cautious." Dr. Wilson, a kindly man in his 50s with spectacles that perpetually slid down his nose, examined Nora in the privacy of her bedroom while Garrett waited anxiously downstairs. His verdict was reassuring. Mother and baby were both healthy, though he advised Nora to rest more in the heat and to prepare for the possibility that the child might arrive earlier than expected. "First babies are unpredictable," he told her, packing his instruments back into his medical bag. "Especially when the mother has been through significant changes or stress, as you have. I'd say you have another 6 weeks or so, but I wouldn't be surprised if this little one decided to make an appearance sooner." The news sent Nora into a flurry of preparation. With Mrs. Espinosa's help, she began readying a corner of her bedroom for the baby, a cradle that Miguel had crafted from cottonwood. Tiny garments sewn from soft fabrics ordered from Hollister's general store. Swaddling blankets embroidered with delicate flowers during the quiet evenings when Nora's fingers itched for her needle and thread. Garrett, too, made preparations, converting a small room adjacent to Nora's into a proper nursery that the baby could use as it grew. He spent his evenings building a chest of drawers and a rocking chair, working by lamplight after the day's ranch chores were complete. Watching him sand the wood to a satiny smoothness, his large hands unexpectedly gentle on the delicate spindles of the rocker, Nora felt a surge of emotion so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. "What is it?" Garrett asked, alarmed when he noticed her silent tears. "Are you in pain?" "Should I send for the doctor again?" "No," Nora assured him, wiping her cheeks with a self-conscious laugh. "It's nothing like that, I'm just happy." The simple truth seemed to catch them both by surprise. Happiness had not been part of their original arrangement, yet here it was nonetheless found in the most unexpected of circumstances. As August gave way to September, the heat began to relent slightly, though the days remained warm. Nora's time was increasingly occupied with preparations for the baby, while Garrett and his men focused on preparing the ranch for the coming winter months. One bright September morning, Nora was sitting on the porch shelling peas for the evening meal when she spotted a cloud of dust on the road from town. Visitors were rare at Cottonwood Creek, especially unannounced ones, and she felt a flicker of unease as she watched the approaching buggy. By the time the vehicle reached the ranch yard, Garrett had emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth and eyeing the visitor with the same wariness Nora felt. The buggy was well appointed, clearly hired from the livery in Holbrook, and the man who descended from it was equally well-dressed, a city man in a tailored suit that looked out of place against the rugged backdrop of the ranch. "Can I help you?" Garrett called, moving to stand protectively near Nora. The stranger removed his hat, revealing dark hair pomaded into a fashionable style. "I'm looking for Nora O'Brien," he said, his gaze moving past Garrett to where Nora sat frozen on the porch steps. "Ah, there you are. You're a difficult woman to track down, my dear." Recognition dawned on Nora with a shock like ice water. "Frederick," she whispered, her hand instinctively moving to her swollen belly. Garrett's posture stiffened at the name. "Frederick who?" he demanded, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Frederick Anderson," the man replied smoothly, taking a step forward, "and I believe I'm addressing the mother of my child." The words hung in the air like gunshots. Nora felt the blood drain from her face, her vision narrowing until all she could see was Frederick's face, the face that had once seemed so handsome to her, now revealed as calculating and cold. "You need to leave," Garrett said, his voice deceptively calm though Nora could see the tension in every line of his body. "Now," Frederick smiled, an expression that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm afraid I can't do that. Not until I've spoken with Nora. We have unfinished business, she and I." "We have nothing to discuss," Nora said, finding her voice at last. She struggled to her feet, one hand braced against the porch railing for support. "You made your position quite clear in Denver." "Circumstances have changed," Frederick replied, his gaze traveling deliberately over her pregnant form. "I've had time to reconsider. In fact, I've come to make things right, to offer marriage as I should have done from the start." A bitter laugh escaped Nora's lips. "Marriage? After you abandoned me without a word? After months of not knowing whether you were alive or dead? You're too late, Frederick. I'm already married." For the first time, Frederick's composure faltered. His gaze shifted to Garrett, noting the protective stance, the wedding ring on his left hand that matched the one on Nora's finger. "I see," he said slowly. "That complicates matters. But surely you understand, sir, that the child she carries is mine by blood." "I have certain rights." "You have no rights here," Garrett interrupted, taking a step forward that made Frederick retreat slightly. "You gave up any claim when you walked away from your responsibilities. The child Nora carries will be born a bishop, raised as my son or daughter, and will want for nothing, certainly not the acknowledgement of a man who couldn't be bothered to stand by its mother." The directness of Garrett's statement left no room for argument. Frederick's expression hardened, the mask of civility slipping to reveal the calculation beneath. "I hadn't expected to find you already married," he admitted, addressing Nora again. "But perhaps that's for the best. A clean separation, if you will. I'm prepared to offer financial compensation, of course." "For the inconvenience, compensation," Nora repeated, disbelief coloring her tone. "You think you can buy your way out of your responsibilities, pay me off, and continue on your way with a clear conscience?" Frederick straightened his jacket, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. "It seems the practical solution. You've clearly arranged a new situation for yourself. I merely wish to fulfill my obligations without unnecessary complications." "Your obligation was to stand by me when I told you I was carrying your child," Nora said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "But you chose to run instead. And now, I've found a man who's more of a father to this baby than you could ever be, even though it doesn't share his blood. Garrett moved to stand beside her, his hand coming to rest supportively at the small of her back. The gesture was not lost on Frederick, whose expression darkened. "I see I've wasted my time in coming here," he said stiffly. "If you change your mind about the financial arrangement, you can reach me at the hotel in Holbrook until tomorrow morning. After that, I'll be returning to Denver." "We won't be changing our minds," Garrett said firmly. "Safe travels, Mr. Anderson." It was a dismissal, plain and simple. Frederick hesitated, clearly unused to being so summarily dispatched, then replaced his hat with a curt nod and returned to his buggy. As he drove away, raising another cloud of dust from the ranch yard, Nora felt her knees give way. Garrett caught her before she could fall, guiding her gently back to the porch seat. "Are you all right?" he asked, his face tight with concern. Nora nodded, though she felt far from all right. Her heart was racing and her hands trembled in her lap. "I never expected to see him again," she admitted. "I thought he was gone for good." "What made him change his mind, do you think?" Garrett asked, sitting beside her with his arm around her shoulders. Nora laughed bitterly. "Money, most likely. Frederick's always been ambitious. He probably decided having an illegitimate child might damage his prospects, so he came to make things right by offering marriage. Or perhaps his family pressured him when they discovered what he'd done. And now that he's found you already married, now he'll go back to Denver and tell everyone he tried to do the honorable thing. But I'd already moved on," Nora said, the familiar patterns of Frederick's manipulations clear to her now. "He'll play the victim, the wronged party who was willing to sacrifice his freedom for a child he's not even sure is his." The unfairness of it all struck Nora anew. Frederick would return to his life in Denver, unburdened, his reputation possibly even enhanced by his noble but rejected offer, while she had endured months of whispers and judgment, had been forced to leave her home and travel to a strange territory to marry a man she'd never met. "He's not worth your anger," Garrett said softly, seeming to read her thoughts. "He's a small man playing at being important, and he's just lost the most valuable thing he'll ever have, the chance to be a father to your child." The simple truth in his words eased some of the tension in Nora's chest. She leaned against Garrett's solid presence, drawing strength from his unwavering support. "Thank you," she whispered, "for standing with me, for claiming this child as yours without hesitation." Garrett turned to face her, his expression solemn. "Nora, I need you to understand something. This baby, your baby, became mine the moment I asked you to marry me. Not because of duty or obligation, but because I chose it, just as I chose you. Blood doesn't make a family. Love does." The word love hung in the air between them, spoken for the first time. Nora's breath caught in her throat as she searched Garrett's face, finding only sincerity in his steady gaze. "Love," she repeated softly, testing the word, the concept that had seemed so unlikely when they made their practical arrangement just months ago. "Yes," Garrett confirmed, a hint of vulnerability in his voice. "I love you, Nora Bishop. I didn't expect to, didn't plan to, but there it is all the same." Tears filled Nora's eyes, but they were different from any she had shed before, not tears of fear or sadness or even relief, but of a joy so pure it almost hurt to contain it. "I love you too," she whispered, the words easier to say than she had imagined, natural as breathing. "I think I have for weeks now, but I was afraid to admit it, even to myself." Garrett's smile was like sunrise breaking over the valley, transforming his features and lighting his eyes with a happiness Nora had never seen there before. He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her a kiss that spoke of promises kept and a future shared, of challenges faced together, and a love that had grown in the unlikeliest of soils. Frederick Anderson's unwelcome appearance, rather than disrupting the life they were building, had only served to confirm what both Nora and Garrett already knew in their hearts. They had found in each other not just convenience or companionship, but the kind of love worth fighting for. The morning after Frederick's visit, Nora awoke with a sense of lightness she hadn't expected. The confrontation, painful as it had provided a kind of closure, a final severing of the ties to her old life in Denver, and the painful chapter Frederick had written in her story. What lay ahead now was the life she and Garrett were building together, a life founded on choice rather than circumstance. September progressed with a gentle easing of summer's grip on the land. The days remained warm, but the nights grew cooler, and the quality of light changed, taking on the golden hue that heralded autumn's approach. Nora found herself watching the shifting seasons with new appreciation, seeing in nature's cycles a reflection of her own journey from the barren winter of abandonment to this unexpected summer of love and promise. As her pregnancy entered its final weeks, Nora's energy waned. Simple tasks that had once been easy, climbing the stairs, gathering eggs from the henhouse, even sitting at the table for meals, now required conscious effort. Garrett noticed her increasing discomfort and took steps to ease her burden, often bringing her breakfast in bed and insisting she rest during the hottest part of the day. "You're coddling me," Nora protested one afternoon when he carried her from the porch to the shade by the creek, despite her assurances that she could walk perfectly well. "I'm taking care of my wife," Garrett corrected, settling her carefully on a blanket spread beneath a cottonwood. "There's a difference." The tender assertiveness in his voice made further argument impossible. Nora leaned back against the tree trunk, watching as Garrett removed his boots and rolled up his trouser legs to wade into the shallow creek. In the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves, with his shirt sleeves pushed up to reveal tanned forearms and his hair falling carelessly across his forehead, he looked younger, almost boyish. "What are you smiling about?" he asked, glancing up to catch her watching him. "Just admiring the view," Nora replied with a frankness that would have scandalized her former self. Garrett's answering smile held a hint of mischief. "Is that so, Mrs. Bishop? Well, the view's not bad from here either." Despite her advanced pregnancy, or perhaps because of it, Nora felt a flutter of desire at the warm appreciation in his gaze. Their physical relationship had progressed cautiously over the past months, mindful of her condition and the newness of their feelings. Kisses and caresses had been exchanged with increasing frequency, but they had stopped short of full intimacy, both understanding that there would be time for that after the baby's arrival. Yet the connection between them had deepened in other ways, through shared confidences in the quiet evenings, through the casual touches that had become second nature, through the thousand small ways they had learned to anticipate each other's needs and preferences. It was a courtship in reverse, the marriage coming first and the falling in love after, but no less meaningful for its unorthodox progression. "I've been thinking," Garrett said, wading back to shore and sitting beside her on the blanket. "After the baby comes and you're recovered, perhaps we should take a trip to Denver." Nora looked at him in surprise. "Denver? Whatever for? To visit your cousin, for one thing, the one who stood by you when everyone else turned their backs." Garrett took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "And to show the good people of that city that Nora O'Brien, Nora Bishop, now is doing just fine without their approval." The suggestion touched Nora deeply. She had exchanged several letters with her cousin Emma since arriving in Arizona, sharing the unexpected turns her life had taken. Emma's replies had been full of relief and cautious happiness for her, though tinged with regret that they were now separated by such distance. "I'd like that," Nora admitted, though I'm not sure I care anymore what the gossips in Denver think of me. All the more reason to go, Garrett said with a grin, to show them their judgment holds no power over you now. The conversation drifted to other future plans improvements to the ranch house that Garrett had been considering, the possibility of expanding their cattle operation, whether they might eventually add horses to their breeding program. It was easy, comfortable talk, the kind shared by partners who expected to face life's challenges and triumphs together for years to come. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, Garrett helped Nora to her feet, and they walked slowly back to the house, his arm around her waist providing support she no longer pretended not to need. The evening ahead promised the simple pleasures that had become the foundation of their shared life, a meal prepared together, perhaps a game of checkers that Garrett pretended to let her win, then reading aloud from one of the books they had both come to enjoy. It was a good life, Nora reflected as they reached the porch steps. Not the life she had imagined for herself when she boarded that stagecoach to Holbrook months ago, but infinitely better than anything she could have planned. The following week brought the first hint of autumn chill, with a brisk wind sweeping down from the northern mountains, and bringing with it the scent of pine and approaching rain. Nora woke before dawn with a strange restlessness, her back aching in a way that felt different from the usual discomforts of late pregnancy. She slipped from bed carefully, trying not to wake Garrett, who had begun sharing her room though not yet her bed in these final weeks, sleeping on a pallet nearby in case she needed him during the night. Moving to the window, Nora watched as the eastern sky lightened, bands of pink and gold announcing the new day. The beauty of the sunrise momentarily distracted her from the persistent ache in her lower back, but as she turned to dress, a sharper pain gripped her, causing her to gasp and clutch the windowsill for support. The sound woke Garrett, who was on his feet and at her side in an instant. "What is it?" "The baby," Nora nodded, trying to breathe through the pain as Dr. Wilson had instructed. "I think so, but it's too early, nearly 3 weeks early." "First babies are unpredictable," Garrett reminded her, echoing the doctor's words. "Let's get you back to bed while I send Tomas for Doc Wilson." The next few hours passed in a blur for Nora. The pain's contractions, she now realized, came with increasing frequency and intensity. Mrs. Espinosa arrived, summoned by Miguel, and took charge with brisk efficiency, sending Garrett from the room despite his protests and preparing the bedroom for the birth. "Men," the older woman muttered as she helped Nora into a clean nightgown. "Always thinking they need to be in the middle of women's business. He can pace the porch like men have been doing since the beginning of time." Despite her discomfort, Nora smiled at the housekeeper's frank assessment. "He's worried," she said, defending Garrett. "This is all new to him." "New to you too," Mrs. Espinosa pointed out, "and you're the one doing the hard work. Now let's get you comfortable. This little one seems eager to meet the world." By the time Dr. Wilson arrived, riding hard from town with his medical bag bouncing against his saddle, Nora's labor was well advanced. The pain was unlike anything she had experienced before, waves that built and crested and threatened to pull her under, requiring all her concentration and strength to ride out. Through it all, she was aware of Garrett's presence just outside the door, his occasional questions to Mrs. Espinosa or Dr. Wilson, his footsteps as he paced the hallway. The knowledge that he was there, waiting and worrying, gave her an anchor in the storm of sensation that had become her world. "You're doing fine, Mrs. Bishop," Dr. Wilson assured her during a brief lull between contractions. "The baby is in good position and everything is progressing normally. It won't be long now." "Garrett," Nora gasped as another contraction began to build. "I want Garrett." Mrs. Espinosa and the doctor exchanged glances. It wasn't customary for husbands to be present at births, but the look in Nora's eyes brooked no argument. "Let him in," Dr. Wilson decided. "If he feels faint, he can always leave again." Garrett entered the room tentatively, his face pale with concern. When he saw Nora, hair dampened with sweat, face contorted with pain, he moved immediately to her side, taking her hand and pressing it to his lips. "I'm here," he said simply. "Tell me what you need." What Nora needed, it turned out, was his steady presence as she labored through the final stage of bringing their child into the world. Garrett never flinched, never looked away, his eyes locked on hers as he murmured encouragement and support. When the doctor instructed Nora to push, Garrett supported her shoulders, his strength helping her find her own. And then, with a final tremendous effort, the baby was born, sliding into the world with a cry that filled the room and Nora's heart simultaneously. "A boy," Dr. Wilson announced, holding up the squalling infant for them to see. "A fine, healthy boy." Tears streamed down Nora's face as the doctor placed the baby on her chest, this small person she had carried for 9 months. Whose existence had altered the course of her life in ways she could never have imagined. He was red-faced and indignant, his tiny fists waving in protest at the bright, cold world he had entered, but to Nora he was perfect. "James," she whispered, looking up at Garrett, who was watching them both with undisguised wonder. "James Garrett Bishop." Garrett's hand trembled slightly as he reached out to touch the baby's head, covered with a surprising amount of dark hair. "Hello, James," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Welcome to the family." The simple words held volumes of meaning. This child, conceived in a relationship built on false promises, carried through months of uncertainty and change, born into a marriage that had begun as a practical arrangement, was now unquestionably a bishop, claimed by Garrett's love as surely as if they shared blood. In the days that followed, Nora watched with deepening love as Garrett embraced fatherhood with the same quiet determination he brought to all aspects of his life. He held James with careful hands, learning to change diapers under Mrs. Espinosa's critical supervision, walking the floor with the fussing infant in the small hours of the night so Nora could rest. "He has your eyes," Garrett observed one evening as they sat together on the porch, James sleeping peacefully in Nora's arms. "That same shade of green." "And my hair, I think," Nora added, gently stroking the dark fuzz on the baby's head. "Though it's too early to be certain." What went unspoken was any resemblance James might bear to his biological father. Frederick Anderson had become increasingly irrelevant in their minds, a footnote in the story of their family, rather than a central character. As autumn settled fully over Cottonwood Creek Ranch, painting the cottonwoods golden and bringing crisp mornings that gave way to mellow afternoons, Nora found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this place of contentment. She had arrived in Arizona territory as a desperate woman with few options and little hope. Now, just months later, she was a wife, a mother, and a rancher's partner in every sense of the word. The transformation was most evident in the moments she shared with Garrett, the quiet intimacy of their evenings after James was asleep, the way they had learned to communicate with a look or a touch, the deepening of their physical relationship as Nora recovered from childbirth, and they discovered each other as lovers as well as partners. "I was thinking," Garrett said one night as they lay together in what was now truly their shared bedroom, "that we might add on to the house next spring. Another bedroom or two." Nora raised herself on one elbow to look at him, noting the slight flush on his cheeks visible even in the dim lamplight. "Planning for the future, Mr. Bishop, always," he replied, his hand coming up to trace the curve of her cheek. "A future with you and James, and perhaps, in time, other children to fill those additional bedrooms." The image his words conjured a house full of children, a family built on choice and love rather than obligation filled Nora with a joy so complete it was almost overwhelming. "I'd like that," she said softly. "Very much." Garrett's smile was tender as he drew her down for a kiss. "Then it's settled. We'll start planning after the winter." Winter in Arizona was milder than the harsh Denver seasons Nora had known, but it brought its own challenges: occasional snow that dusted the valley like powdered sugar, cold rains that turned the roads to mud, winds that found every crack in the house's weatherproofing. Through it all, life at Cottonwood Creek continued its steady rhythm, now adjusted to include the needs and schedule of the youngest Bishop. James thrived, growing from a newborn into an infant with remarkable speed. He learned to smile, a gummy, whole-face grin that never failed to elicit answering smiles from everyone around him. He discovered his hands, spending long periods examining his fingers as if they were the most fascinating objects in the world. He began to respond to voices, turning his head toward Nora when she sang or Garrett when he spoke in the deep, gentle tone he reserved for his son. For Nora, watching Garrett with James became one of her greatest joys. The big, capable rancher who could break a wild horse or wrestle a calf to the ground for branding would sit for hours with the infant cradled in his arms, talking to him about cattle breeding or weather patterns or the proper way to mend a fence. James appeared to listen with solemn attention, his green eyes fixed on Garrett's face as if absorbing every word. "He's going to be a rancher like his pa," Miguel observed one evening when Garrett was demonstrating the finer points of rope braiding to the 4-month-old. "Look how he watches everything." "He's a quick learner," Garrett agreed proudly. "Takes after his mother that way." The casual acknowledgement of James as his son, the natural way Garrett had assumed the role of father, never ceased to touch Nora deeply. There were moments like now, watching them together in the warm glow of the fire, when she almost forgot that James was not Garrett's by blood. So complete was the bond between them. As winter gave way to spring, the valley burst into life with a profusion of wildflowers carpeting the pastures and new leaves unfurling on the cottonwoods by the creek. James, now 6 months old, was sitting up on his own, reaching eagerly for anything within his grasp, and beginning to experiment with sounds that might someday become words. True to his word, Garrett began work on the addition to the house, enlisting Miguel and Tomas's help with the construction, while Mrs. Espinosa and Nora managed the household and cared for James. The project became a focal point for the entire ranch, with everyone offering opinions on the layout and features of the new rooms. "We should have a proper dining room," Mrs. Espinosa insisted. "Big enough for when you have guests. And windows facing east," Miguel added, "for the morning light." Garrett took their suggestions seriously, incorporating them into his plans when practical. To Nora's surprise, he also consulted her on every decision, from the placement of doors to the height of the windowsills. "It's your home, too," he reminded her when she expressed astonishment at being asked about such details. "More yours than mine, really. You're the one who turned this house into a home." The simple truth of his statement struck Nora with unexpected force. She had indeed made this place her own, rearranging furniture to create conversational groupings, sewing curtains that brightened the rooms, planting flowers that welcomed visitors to the front porch. What had once been a bachelor's functional dwelling had become, under her touch, a family home filled with warmth and life. As spring deepened into summer, The addition to the house took shape: 2 new bedrooms and a proper dining room connected to the main structure by a wide hallway. Garrett worked on the project in every spare moment, often continuing by lamplight after the day's ranch work was complete. "You're pushing yourself too hard," Nora chided one evening, finding him still sawing boards long after sunset. "The house isn't going anywhere. The work can wait." Garrett set down his tools with a rueful smile. "I want it finished before James starts walking. At the rate he's growing, that won't be long." Indeed, their son was developing rapidly. Now army crawling across the floor with determined energy, pulling himself up on furniture, and standing with support. His babbling had increased, occasionally producing sounds that might have been "mama" or "dada," though neither Nora nor Garrett was sure enough to claim the honor of his first word. "He'll be walking soon enough," Nora agreed, leading Garrett back to the house. "But he needs his father well rested and whole, not exhausted or injured from working in poor light." Garrett allowed himself to be persuaded, following her inside where James was already asleep in his crib. One small hand curled beside his cheek in a gesture that never failed to melt both parents' hearts. "Sometimes I still can't believe he's ours," Garrett murmured, gazing down at the sleeping infant. "That we made this family, you and I." "From the most unlikely of beginnings," Nora agreed, leaning against him as his arm slipped around her waist. "Not so unlikely," Garrett countered. "Looking back, it seems almost inevitable you arriving in Holbrook just when I was beginning to think I might always be alone. Me happening to be in town the day you discovered Howard had died. As if we were meant to find each other." The sentiment, unexpectedly romantic coming from practical Garrett, brought a smile to Nora's lips. "Are you suggesting it was fate, Mr. Bishop?" "I'm suggesting," he replied, turning to face her fully, "that some things are meant to be, Mrs. Bishop. And this us, James, our life together feels like one of those things." Nora couldn't argue with his assessment. Despite the unconventional path that had brought them together, their marriage had developed a rightness, a sense of belonging that she had never experienced before. What had begun as an arrangement of mutual convenience had grown into a partnership founded on respect and trust, and finally blossomed into a love neither of them had anticipated, but both now cherished beyond measure. By late summer, the addition to the house was complete, painted to match the original structure and furnished with pieces Garrett had either built himself or ordered from catalogs with Nora's guidance. The new dining room hosted its first official dinner in August, with Dr. and Mrs. Wilson, Reverend and Mrs. Shepherd, and Sheriff Parker as guests to celebrate James's first birthday. The milestone was marked with a cake Mrs. Espinosa had baked, decorated with a single candle that fascinated James far more than the cake itself. He sat in his high chair, another of Garrett's creations, wearing a new outfit Nora had sewn, looking around at the gathered adults with bright curiosity. "Hard to believe it's been a year," Sheriff Parker remarked, accepting a slice of cake from Mrs. Espinosa. "Seems like yesterday I was meeting you at the stagecoach, Miss O'Brien, Mrs. Bishop, I should say." "A year of changes," Dr. Wilson agreed, raising his glass in a toast. "To the Bishop family, Garrett, Nora, and young James. May your next year bring as much happiness as the first." The toast was echoed around the table, with even Mrs. Espinosa joining in despite her usual reluctance to participate in such fussy business. As Nora looked around at the faces of these people who had become her friends and extended family, she felt a wave of gratitude for the life she had found in this corner of Arizona territory. Later that evening, after the guests had departed, and James had been put to bed, exhausted from the excitement, Nora and Garrett sat on the porch swing that had been his gift to her on their first anniversary. The night was warm, the sky ablaze with stars, and the scent of the roses Nora had planted along the porch railing hung sweetly in the air. "Happy?" Garrett asked, his arm around her shoulders as they swayed gently. "Completely," Nora replied, resting her head against him. "Though I was thinking about something Mrs. Wilson said tonight." "What's that?" She mentioned how quickly children grow, how soon James will have siblings to play with. Nora hesitated, then added, "She seemed to assume we're planning to have more children soon." Garrett's hand tightened slightly on her shoulder. "And how did you respond?" "I said we were enjoying this time with James, but yes, we hope to give him brothers or sisters in the future." Nora tilted her face up to look at him. "Was that presumptuous of me?" Garrett's smile was tender in the moonlight. "Not at all. I've been thinking the same thing myself. This house is meant for a family, a large one." The confirmation of their shared vision for the future warmed Nora's heart. "I never imagined I could be this happy," she admitted softly. "When I left Denver, I thought the best I could hope for was security and perhaps a measure of respect. I never dreamed I would find this, Garrett prompted, his eyes intent on her face. "Love," Nora said simply. "A partner, a true home. You've given me all of that, Garrett, and more." He shook his head slightly. "We've given it to each other. That's what makes it real, that we built this life together, choice by choice, day by day." As if to emphasize his point, a cry came from inside the house, James awakening, perhaps from a dream or simply missing the comfort of his parents' presence. Garrett rose immediately. "I'll get him," he said. "You stay and enjoy the evening air." Nora watched him go, this man who had once been a stranger and was now the center of her world. She thought of the journey that had brought her to Cottonwood Creek, Ranch, the desperate decision to become a mail-order bride, the discovery of Howard Mills's death, Garrett's unexpected proposal on the hotel porch in Holbrook. Each step had seemed fraught with uncertainty at the time, yet each had led her inexorably toward this life of unexpected joy. When Garrett returned a few minutes later with a sleepy James in his arms, Nora's heart swelled with love for both of them, her husband and their son, the family they had created against all odds. James reached for her with a drowsy smile, settling contentedly in her lap as Garrett rejoined them on the swing. "I think he just wanted to be sure we were still here," Garrett said, gently smoothing James's dark hair. "We are," Nora assured him, though she knew the words were meant for all three of them. "And we always will be." Together they sat in the warm summer night, the family that circumstance had thrown together but love had truly forged, watching the stars wheel overhead and listening to the timeless sounds of Cottonwood Creek, Ranch, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant lowing of cattle, the gentle creak of the porch swing marking the rhythm of their shared life. In the years that followed, the Bishop family flourished along with the ranch. James grew from a toddler into a sturdy boy with his mother's green eyes and thoughtful nature, and his father's determination and love of the land. He was joined in time by a sister, Grace Elizabeth, born on a spring morning 2 years after James, and later by a brother, Thomas Michael, whose arrival during a winter snowstorm tested even Dr. Wilson's considerable skills. The house expanded again to accommodate the growing family, with Garrett adding a schoolroom where Nora taught the children their letters and numbers before they were old enough to attend the school in Holbrook. The garden thrived under Nora's care, providing vegetables for their table and flowers for the house year-round. The ranch prospered as well, with Garrett's careful management expanding their cattle operation and establishing a reputation for quality horses that brought buyers from as far away as California. Through it all, the foundation remained the same, the partnership between Nora and Garrett that had begun as a practical arrangement and had grown into a love story neither of them could have written for themselves. They faced the challenges of ranch life together. Droughts that threatened their cattle, economic downturns that strained their finances, the normal conflicts and compromises of any marriage. But they also shared its joys. The satisfaction of work well done, the pleasure of watching their children grow, the deepening bond between them that made each year sweeter than the last. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Garrett surprised Nora with a journey back to Denver, a trip they had discussed over the years, but had never found time to undertake with the demands of the ranch and young children. They left James, now 11 and responsible beyond his years, in charge of his siblings under the watchful eyes of Miguel. Now semi-retired but still very much part of the family, and Mrs. Espinosa, who flatly refused to even consider retirement despite her advancing age. Denver had changed in the decade since Nora had left, growing from a frontier town into a bustling city with electric streetlights and paved roads. Yet some things remained the same: her cousin, Emma's welcoming embrace, the familiar spires of the cathedral where Nora had once attended services, the view of the mountains that had been the backdrop of her childhood. They stayed for 2 weeks, introducing themselves as Mr. and Mrs. Garrett Bishop, ranchers from Arizona Territory. If anyone remembered Nora O'Brien and the scandal that had surrounded her departure, they gave no sign of it. What they saw instead was a confident woman in fashionable but practical clothing, with a wedding ring on her finger and a successful husband at her side, a woman who had clearly made a good life for herself, far from the whispers and judgments of Denver society. On their final evening in the city, Garrett took Nora to dinner at one of the finest restaurants, where they were seated at a table near the window overlooking the lamp-lit street. As they waited for their meal, Nora noticed a familiar figure entering the establishment: Frederick Anderson, older but unmistakable, with a woman who must be his wife and 2 children of about James's age. For a moment, Nora felt a flicker of the old pain and humiliation. Then she caught Garrett's eye across the table and saw in his gaze all that they had built together: the love, the trust, the life that would have been impossible had Frederick not made the choice he did all those years ago. "Shall we invite them to join us?" Garrett asked quietly, having followed her gaze and recognized the man from their one brief meeting a decade earlier. Nora considered the suggestion, then shook her head with a smile. "No," she said simply. "They're part of a different life, one I've long since left behind." As if sensing their discussion, Frederick glanced in their direction. For a moment, his expression registered blank courtesy, the automatic acknowledgement of strangers in a public place. Then recognition dawned, and Nora saw a complex series of emotions cross his face: surprise, discomfort, perhaps even regret. Nora inclined her head slightly in a polite nod, then deliberately turned her attention back to Garrett, signaling that any connection between them was firmly in the past. It was, she realized, the final closure on a chapter of her life that had once seemed defining, but now felt like little more than a footnote in the much larger, richer story she had written with Garrett. Their return to Cottonwood Creek was like coming home in the truest sense of the word. The children met them at the edge of the property, James on his own pony with Grace riding behind him, and Thomas bouncing with excitement on Miguel's saddle. The house welcomed them with the scent of Mrs. Espinosa's cooking and fresh-cut flowers from the garden that Grace had arranged in vases throughout the rooms. That night, after the children were in bed and the house had settled into its familiar night sounds, Nora and Garrett stood on the porch, looking out over the land that had been the setting for their unexpected love story. "It's good to be home," Nora said, leaning into Garrett's embrace. The best part of going away, he agreed, is coming back to all of this. Nora knew he meant more than just the physical place, the ranch, the house, the land. He meant the life they had built together, the family they had created, the love that had grown from the most unpromising of beginnings into something strong and enduring. It was a story she would never tire of, remembering how a pregnant mail-order bride had discovered her intended groom had died, and the cowboy next door had proposed that very day. How a practical arrangement had slowly, steadily transformed into a love that defined them both. How the child she had carried in fear and uncertainty had become the first branch of a family tree now flourishing in the Arizona soil. As the stars appeared one by one in the vast desert sky, Nora offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the twists of fate that had brought her to this place, this man, this life. What had once seemed like the end of all her hopes had proven to be only the beginning of a journey more beautiful than she could have imagined. Garrett's arms tightened around her, as if he could read her thoughts. "Happy?" he asked, echoing the question he had first asked on this same porch a decade earlier. "More than I ever dreamed possible," Nora replied, turning in his embrace to kiss him, her husband, her partner, the love she had found when she least expected it but needed it most. "Absolutely, completely happy." And she was.